Good afternoon, everybody. We'll get started. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar called Honoring APIDA Heritage in the Classroom with PBS Resources. My name is Desi Nixon, and I'm an Education Engagement Specialist here at PBS Wisconsin Education. And we're so delighted to have you here today for a quick 30 minutes worth of all kinds of resources that you can implement in your classroom this week. At PBS Wisconsin Education, we both create classroom media that's standards aligned, Wisconsin focused, and free to use for pre-K through 12. We have video games, interactive content, educator guides, and more. You can check those out on our website. We also facilitate professional development, much like today, sharing, supporting resources that educators can use in the classroom and pedagogical practices. Our series that we're starting today is part of our larger goal at PBS Wisconsin Education in working towards anti-racism and social justice. We recognize that bias and unlearning the practice of racism demands education, listening, and action on all of our parts. And it's with this in mind that we've created this spring series honoring APIDA Heritage Month.
We'd be remiss. Hi, everyone. My name is Moon Al-Gaifi, and Desi is my wonderful colleague. I am an Early Learning Engagement Specialist at PBS Wisconsin. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'd be remiss if we didn't mention the heightened fear experienced by many Asian Americans in the wake of COVID-19 due to increasing rates of anti-Asian harassment and violence. We continue to grieve the senseless killing of 8 Asian people in Atlanta and the horrific acts of violence victimizing our Asian brothers and sisters in cities around the country. As succinctly summarized in a recent press release from the White House, present-day inequities faced by Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities are rooted in our nation's history of exclusion, discrimination, racism, and xenophobia against Asian Americans. Asian Americans have endured a long history of injustice, including the Page Act of 1875, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the incarceration of Japanese American citizens during World War II, the murder of Vincent Chin, the mass shooting of Southeast Asian refugee children in 1989, and the targeting of South Asian Americans, especially those who are Muslim, Hindu, or Sikh, after the tragedy of 9/11. As educators, it is our duty to be aware of the injustices, discrimination, and oppression faced by historically excluded communities in the United States. It is our responsibility to regularly check our curriculum, our classroom procedures, our inevitable biases, to ensure that we are truly creating equitable learning environments for all students. After this webinar today, you will receive a list of resources mentioned during our time together. We'll be sharing a list of resources for educators aligned with stopping Asian hate and supporting Asian students, including a statement from Learning for Justice, which was previously called Teaching Tolerance, and a lesson plan resource on how to teach about anti-Asian racism and xenophobia. We hope that these resources will be beneficial for your teaching practice and for all the students that you work with. We are mindful of the fact that many of our attendees work in ethnically homogeneous schools or learning environments, and one of our goals with this webinar series is that you will learn about resources and strategies that will strengthen and deepen your own understanding of these culturally relevant and critical issues in education today. With that being said, let's dive in.
As Muna said, today is the start of our spring series, APIDA, Honoring APIDA Heritage in the Classroom with PBS Resources. This series, you will have the opportunity to unearth PBS digital resources you can use to expand APIDA history in your classroom, discover strategies to build community with all of your students in urban and rural settings, and engage in critical conversation with peers across the state. We'll do that through a series of different webinars. Today is our first one of those, but we have upcoming opportunities that you might be interested in as well. On May 11th, we'll have a panel of educators from across the state talking about working cross-culturally with families and communities. This will be followed in June with a webinar from educators and administrators talking about building community in urban and rural school settings. And we'll conclude this series with a mini EdCamp chat where educators, all of you will be able to come together and bring the conversations that we've started, choose what you want to talk about, and talk with your peers about those. We'd love to have you at any of these events, and you can register for these events by going to pbswisconsineducation.org/events to register for any of these free events.
So at this point, you may have heard or seen a few different phrases about the month of May. You may have heard Asian American Heritage Month. You may have heard Asian Heritage Month, Asian Pacific Islander Desi American Heritage Month, Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And while they're in Desi, you can click through and those will pop up on the screen. And so while there isn't a universally agreed upon acronym for this month, the overarching goal is to pay tribute to the generations of Asians and those of Asian descent who have enriched the US's history and are instrumental in its future success. It's also important to know that within non-white communities, there are often conflicted views of lumping large groups of people together, such as with terms people of color, or even BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. And the same is true with APIDA, or Asian Pacific Islander Desi American, that the experiences of a Chinese American, and a Hmong person, and an Uyghur Muslim seeking asylum, and a Sikh woman, for example, are not all the same. And it's really crucial to be aware of that and note that for many people in non-white communities, it's unfair to have all of our experiences and cultural differences lumped into one category. And so while it is important that there is a dedicated month for honoring Asian people, I highly encourage you to use it as an opportunity to learn about resources, which you guys are all doing by showing up today, and learning about strategies you can bring into your classrooms or learning spaces all year round. Asian history, Black contributions, Native culture, it matters 365 days of the year and should be consistently embedded into our learning resources if we want to raise a future generation of global-minded, culturally respectful, and curious individuals. Next slide, please. So for the first few minutes here, I'm going to focus on resources that are for young children, and then Desi is going to share an abundance of resources for some older kiddos. And one thing that I want to touch on is that research has taught us that exposure to media, both physical and digital, shapes the thoughts, perceptions, and behaviors of young children. They intake media as a reflection of reality. Now, imagine being a young children and all of the books your teacher reads, or the clips your teacher shows, or even the most popular shows on television are void of any characters that look like you. This lack of representation leads to negative psychological outcomes for underrepresented children, including low self-esteem and low self-confidence. Who they are, their culture, hairstyles, skin tones, language, and daily practices are rendered invisible and subjected to what mainstream media constitutes as normal, regular characters, which are overwhelmingly white, female, able-bodied, and well-off. And as we know, young children are particularly vulnerable to media messages and use what they see in media to create their beliefs about themselves and others. PBS, as a media industry, holds great power over the socialization and self-concept of young people. And some of the digital media pieces we'll show you today exemplify the work that we are doing to reduce the disparities that exist in children's media. We know that media can influence viewers in positive ways, and it can often become problematic when considering the underrepresentation or negative portrayal of certain identities such as gender, race, disability, and socioeconomic status. Luckily, a lot is changing with books being published and new series being produced, which is crucial for the development of our future multicultural young children. But for the purpose of this webinar, I'll be focusing, and we will be focusing exclusively on Asian representation in PBS Kids. Next slide, please. So this is just a really popular infographic that we wanted to share that demonstrates some of the points that were touched on earlier. As of 2018, only 7% of children's books include characters that were Asian Pacific Islander. If you haven't had a chance to visit the Cooperative Children's Book Center's website, CCBC, they analyze annual data on the representation of non-white groups in literature, and they create really incredible book list recommendations for diversifying your bookshelf. We actually, PBS Wisconsin Education just had a really great webinar with them a few months ago. So I highly recommend checking out our YouTube channel and watching that webinar to learn about ways that you can diversify your bookshelves. We can include that in the post-event email. Next slide, please. Speaking of books, PBS for Parents is a really great resource for book lists, activity ideas, and conversation starters with young children. And one of the resources to look out for in the post-webinar email is this book list of books you can add to your collection that specifically celebrate Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Next slide, please. All right, let's dive in. So on the subject of race, class, and culture, the first resource that I wanted to share with you all today is called the ABCs of Racial Literacy. Sesame Workshop, the nonprofit educational organization behind Sesame Street, has recently released new resources to support families in talking to their children about race and racism. The ABCs of Racial Literacy is part of Coming Together, Sesame Workshop's ongoing commitment to racial justice. And it's designed to provide families with the tools they need to build racial literacy, to have open conversations with young children, to engage allies and advocates to become upstanders against racism, and more. So Coming Together includes a racial justice education framework, ongoing research, and a rolling release of new content, which you can find at sesameworkshop.org/coming-together, which we will of course include in the post-event email. Next slide, please. The next resource that I wanted to share with you today is Xavier Riddle and the Secret Museum, which is a PBS Kids show based on the popular book series, Ordinary People Change the World. The show follows the adventures of Xavier Riddle, his sister Yadina, and their friend Brad as they travel back in time to meet real-life historical figures when they were kids. Not only do children get to learn about history, cultures, and lifestyles from around the world in the series, but there are also digital games online at pbskids.org that extend the learning experience from the episodes. And so when we send out our email after this event today, you'll be able to have access to our slides. So you can click on these different links that are hyperlinked here. And so the first one is a digital game called Hero Maker, where if young children are learning about historical figures in their classroom, they can create their own hero in this digital game. And then the second hyperlinked is a educator resource connected to Xavier Riddle that you can use in your classroom this week. And it focuses on, actually, why don't we click on that really quickly, Desi, just to show them what that looks like. Thank you. This is an example of an educator resource that is ready to use, that is built off of Xavier Riddle. So it extends from the children watching the episode and getting to enjoy seeing the characters, but also actually learning about real life historical figures. So it's a 2-page bio sketch that talks about Tomoyoko Tasai's early life, what he did through studying and exploring, and it describes some of the art that he created. Thank you, Desi. We can head back to the slides. Thank you. The next resource that I wanted to share is from PBS Wisconsin Education, and it's our very own digital media resource, and it's called Wisconsin Biographies. And it's a great resource for upper elementary and middle schoolers. Wisconsin Biographies teaches students about historical figures in Wisconsin who have made a great contribution to our state's history. The digital collection includes an animated video, 3 leveled e-readers, photos, and an activity where, much like Hero Maker with Xavier Riddle, children can create their own trading cards based on the historical figure that they are learning about. And the biography that we want to highlight today is about Zhobi Zhang, who was a Hmong refugee here in Wisconsin, and he was the first Hmong person to be elected for office here in Wisconsin. So Jesse, if you could click on that link just so that we could show them the beautiful landing page looks like. Up at the top, you'll see teachers, activities, and if you click on stories, you'll be able to see all the different stories of Wisconsin figures we have. And so this is kind of what one of the pages looks like for one of the Wisconsin biographies. There's this animated video. There are these 3 different leveled e-readers that talk about his life and his accomplishments. And it's a really great way to connect young students with local relevant topics for people who have made a difference here in Wisconsin. Thank you, Desi. And in closing, I wanted to share a PBS Kids clip from the animated series Let's Go Luna that highlights various aspects of Chinese culture. So if in your learning spaces you were learning about the Moon Festival, the Chinese Bell, or the Beijing Drum Tower, these clips would do a wonderful job as an extension activity and touch on the importance of representation in children's media. For the purpose of time, I won't play any clips today. I'm sorry if you got excited about that, but we will include it in the event email afterwards so that you can look through and see the way that PBS Kids represents some aspects of Chinese culture in this episode, because they do it in a really, really great way. Next slide, please. And that's all from me.
Thank you, Muna. I'm going to continue to go over a few additional resources. Most of these are for upper elementary into middle and then high school. The next one that I'd like to share is called Resound, Songs of Wisconsin. This is a collection of educational resources that we made in collaboration with Wisconsin School Music Association. Through a statewide survey, there was a call for music educators and educators across the state for more culturally relevant resources about music. And so one of the featured musicians in Resound is Ma Vu. I'm going to show you what the website looks like a little bit. Resound features 4 different musicians. The one we'll look at today, Ma Vu. Ma Vu lives in Wisconsin, in Wausau specifically, and she is a singer, and all of her music is in the Hmong language. She both marries traditional music and more contemporary music to make this really unique sound. The resource itself includes an interview with Ma Vu, where she talks about the importance of music for herself, for her connection with her father and to her culture, along with questions to consider, a music performance, as well as an educator guide that has a ton of activities that look at culture and the combination of culture and music. The next couple of resources I'm going to talk about are all available on PBS Learning Media. PBS Learning Media is a national collection of thousands and thousands of resources that are all free, standards aligned, easily searchable by grade level. There are videos, interactive lesson plans, and they're all integrated easily into a Google Classroom. The first one is a collection called Asian Americans, and the grade level for this is 7 through 12. But different parts could be used for younger students as well. In this collection, there are 37 videos, all taken from a 4 to 5 hour documentary called Asian Americans, and they've broken it up into little pieces to look at different historical moments in the country. 30 different lesson plans, background readings, discussion questions, and activities. I'm going to show you an example of what one looks like. So if you go to PBS Learning Media and Google search for Asian Americans, you'll come across this collection. And one that I'm going to show you that has a lot of really interesting information. You can click by topic. So this one says the Chinese Exclusion Act. There's both a short video, so they've broken it up into 3-minute chunks, which is really nice for the classroom. You can watch the video. There's also a lesson plan. The lesson plan has a background essay, discussion questions, activities, and all of this is in connection with that video. The other thing I love about this is that there are primary resources right here that can be used as additional documentation. So this is actually, see if you can view this like this, you can see the Chinese Exclusion Act and have students actually read it rather than just kind of think about it in a Google Doc. Here's that image, as well as transcript to the video, background readings. There are different activities. So you can see that there are classroom discussions, as well as activities for all these different topics. So the Asian American collection, again, has 37 different videos. So any kind of time period that you're looking at, you can explore that set of videos. One of my favorite new PBS resources is called Unladylike. And Unladylike is a history of 26 little-known progressive era women that are diverse in profession, race, ethnicity, geographical and class backgrounds who really broke barriers in a then male-dominated businesses and science and arts. And so there are 3 stories, 3 biographies of Chinese American women who are included in the Unladylike series. These are a little bit for older grades 7 through 12, and I would recommend watching them before you show them. Some of them do deal with some topics that might be difficult in the classroom. I'm going to show you just a second clip so you can see just how beautifully done these are.
She was a Chinese American woman who broke boundaries, pioneering anti-trafficking activists who saw a social injustice and decided to do something about it. Say I don't act right, it's unladylike, how I wanna live my life. 1912, San Francisco, California. 25-year-old Tai Leung Schultz was hailed as the first Chinese American woman to cast a ballot in a U.S. election.
At that time, women didn't have the right to vote in America, but in 1911, California, very forward-thinking state, gave women the right to vote.
What I love about this series is just the beautiful artwork, the combination of historical images, and really showing an in-depth story of somebody who's made such, broke such boundaries. So there are 3 stories on there of Chinese American women. The next resource I'd like to share is grades 6 through 13. What this collection does, it's from the Digital Public Library of America, and it provides students with a wealth of primary sources. And it's actually lessons on using primary sources, but there are 3 different units that can be used for APIDA heritage. We have primary sources, early Chinese immigrants, Japanese American internment, and we can see actually 4 different ones. I'm going to show you what these look like. When you go to the page, there's both background information, you'll find some resources, you'll find a teaching guide, how to use the different activities. But here's the most exciting part, I think, are these primary sources. There are a variety of images, as well as, this is a flyer that was distributed by trade unions for a boycott of Chinese and Japanese run businesses, as well as political cartoons that were seen during that time period. And with the use of these, you can help students think about not only how to use primary sources, but they're really investigating and getting deep into the history. And so then you see in the teaching guide, each one of these links is one of those primary sources. So the discussion questions and the classroom activities are integrating those primary sources in a really meaningful way. And on to Muna.
Yeah, in closing, I just wanted to share that PBS is also acknowledging and celebrating Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month through the special series. And so you can tune in to watch all of these different series that are going to be premiering this month, from the Far East Deep South to A People's History of Asian America. And so I just wanted to kind of highlight this real quickly before we sign off for the day and head into any questions and answers.